I am going to get so much hate for this video. What's up, guys? Canadian Guy here, and boy, this video is gonna ruffle people's feathers and get quite a few people frazzled. But here we are anyway. So unless you've been living under a rock, in which case, welcome to the modern world, we can now get food at the tap of a single button on our phones. Anyway, you would know that nostalgia and remakes have been a huge hit right now. Of course, starting with the Crash Insane trilogy to Spyro, Resident Evil, and Medieval. There are many nostalgic games in between here that have been making epic comebacks to hit old-time fans right in the heart, and I think it's amazing. But specifically, I want to point to the direction of the two main boyos on this channel, the crazed nutbag Crash Bandicoot and the feisty Roastmaster Spyro. So both of these guys have made epic comebacks in the past few years, being kings of the PlayStation in their time in the original trilogies. However, as soon as the titles were handed off to different companies, things took a turn for the franchises. None of the games that came out after the original trilogies came as close to the renown that the originals did, other than Vicarious Visions and Toys for Bob's remakes. Though some of these games did have a cult following, to the general public most of these titles were a solid pass. However, with Vicarious's and Toys for Bob's excellent remakes, people have come forward screaming that they want the same style of remakes for their favorite spin-off of Crash and Spyro games. These statements were then cranked up to 11 when Crash Team Racing Remake was announced as, once again, another old Crash title coming back in HD splendor. There have been requests for Spyro Enter the Dragonfly, Hero's Tale Remake, The Legend of Spyro Trilogy, Crash Bash, Wrath of Cortex, and, well, probably one of the loudest out of everyone, Crash to Insanity. But I am here with a strong opinion. I have talked about this in private and on live streams many times, but it's finally high time that I put my mark down on how I feel about all of this and explain why. I do not want any more Crash Bandicoot or Spyro the Dragon remakes or remasters. Not a single one. Now, of course, before I continue with my explanation, this is simply my opinion. You can have your opinion as well, but at least hear me out as I bring as many facts that I can to the table and look at this situation as objectively as possible. And I hope that you all can do the same. I believe that another remake after the original trilogy would literally be the worst thing that both Crash and Spyro could do. Yes, I can hear people say, but what about CTR? And I'll get to that, don't worry. These games that came out after the original trilogy, not one performed as well as to any of the original titles, in both terms of sales and critical reception. So, in the most objective sense possible, the best games that these IPs have ever produced were the original trilogies, as they performed the best in both of these categories. But not just by a little bit, but by a landslide. Now, instead of me telling you, let's take a look at the sales and the reviews of all of these spin-offs. Now, I will be using VG charts to state the following numbers. The sources to each chart are in the description below. These are only the numbers I could find when it came to these titles. Some people disagree with using this site, but for older games, it could at least give a bare minimum and gives a good estimation of how many copies were sold. So keep that in mind when you see these numbers, that there is obviously a margin for error. However, I will also be using Metacritic for critical reviews, and it is a website that collects as many professional reviews as possible and condenses them all together and makes it a score out of 100. So these have most definitely less room for error. So if you don't like the sales, that's okay, just refer to the critical reception. So right off the hop, I am going to take the original trilogies from both Crash and Spyro, find out each score for each game, and create an average across the board. Now, because these games are much older, Metacritic was only able to dig up info on both Spyro 3 and Crash 3. But don't worry, there are information for all the other games. So I went looking through the internet to find other reviews, finding IGN's and GameSpot's old reviews, as they were the biggest reviewers at the time in gaming. So let's get to the averages. Let's start with Crash. Crash 1 scored an average of a 71.5 out of 100 in the critical score. Crash 2 scored an 85.5 out of 100, and Metacritic score for Crash 3 based on 12 reviews averaged at a 91. The overall trilogy scoring an 82.6 out of 100. Spyro 1 scored a 76.5 out of 100 when it came to critical scoring. Spyro 2 scored an 87 out of 100. And Metacritic score based off of 15 critics averages at a 91 for the third game, scoring an average of an 84.8 across the original trilogy in terms of a critic score. Now let's take a quick look at the sales. The original Crash trilogy shipped an average of 7.1 million units for each game on one singular console. Trust me, this is important to remember, as many of the featured games came out on multiple consoles. Now, let's look at Spyro. Spyro shipped an average of 4 million units for each game on one console. So we now have an average of both sales and critic scores, the most objective stats that we can get on these games possible without a subjective point of view. Now, it is time to look at all the other games that Crash and Spyro have come out with and compare the sales and critic scores. I am leaving out CTR because it hits a special rule. I will explain why later. Also, I will only be comparing to console games, as the portable versions required so much changing it almost became a brand new game in general. Crash Bash scored an average critic score of a 68 and sold 3.39 million units on one console. Crash Wrath of Cortex scored an average score of a 66 and sold 7.24 million units total across three consoles. Crash to Insanity scored an average of a 65 and sold 790,000 units total across two consoles. Crash Mind Over Mutant scored an average of a 67.6 and sold 1.41 million units across three consoles. Crash of the Titans scored an average critic score of a 68 out of 100 and sold 1.1 million units across three consoles. But do you see the problem yet? I'm not including the other Crash racing games, because those are not main platforming Crash games, but if you really want to know all the previous Crash racing games average as in terms of a critic score with the exception of CTR, it's the 67.6. With the exception of Wrath of Cortex, every single Crash game didn't even come close to the sales of the original trilogy. In fact, Twinsanity didn't even break 1 million units sold across two consoles. And every single critic score could not even pass a 7 out of 10. They all average at a 6.5 out of 10. Also, Wrath of Cortex, though hit close to the average of the original Crash games, piggybacked off the success of the original trilogy, as this was the comeback to the platforming genre after Crash Bash and Crash Team Racing. Let's also remember that Wrath of Cortex was released across three consoles, which means that the title has a further reach and a much larger audience than the original trilogy, as the original trilogy was only released on a single console. Even if you were to ignore the sales, as some don't like BG charts and stats, you can't ignore the critics and their scores. Remember, Metacritic scores over multiple people's reviews, so this all can't be blamed on a single bad review. It takes many reviews and averages them out. Objectively, Crash's original trilogy did way better than any of the other games that came out. Now, before I get hit with the "but what if we were to fix the problems" argument with these games, I'll get to that after we look at Spyro and his games. So let us compare Spyro's original trilogy and the games that came after. Again, remember, this is console games only. Spyro Enter the Dragonfly scored an average critic score of a 52 out of 100 and sold 2.68 million units across two consoles. Spyro A Hero's Tale average critic score of a 62 out of 100 and sold 1 million units across three consoles. New Beginnings scored an average score of a 66 out of 100, and the sales numbers were not complete at the time of this video, so I can't give you the sales of the first Legend of Spyro game, I apologize. Eternal Night scored a 54 out of 100 and sold 630,000 units across 2 consoles. Dawn of the Dragon scored a 61 out of 100 and sold 1.72 million units across 4 consoles. Again, am I making myself crystal clear? None of these games, in terms of critic score or sales, came close to the original trilogy. Once again, even if you ignore the sales, the highest rated game was a 66! I am not including Skylanders games because they are kind of their own brand of games. So, as objectively as possible, with no nostalgia goggles on, no bias, just looking at the scores and numbers, the original trilogies reign supreme in both Crash and Spyro's IPs. So, in a business sense, why on earth would a company want to remake any of these games? You have to remember, these companies are in the business of making money, not to appease a small section of fan bases. I loved some of these games as a child and I still hold them preciously to my heart today. But I know in the back of my mind that they will never be remade or shouldn't be remade because of their lack of performance in reviews and sales. For Activision, or any company for that matter, to make a remake based on these stats alone would highly likely be operating at a loss. Plus, how could you pitch to the investors that you want to remake a game that only sold 1 million units and was deemed overall as meh, when today's gaming market is so competitive? You're starting at a disadvantage and investors won't back it, which will hurt future projects as well. And even if you get the project approved, the sales won't come close to the original remaster, judging by this audience, and when the following game comes out that's going to be brand new, the sales won't be as good because we stayed back for so long. Now, some have argued that if we fix these games, like we know Twinsanity had cut content, and Enter the Dragonfly's production was nothing but a circus, so what if we fixed these games? Again, this does not seem like a good idea to me. See, we are asking to take assets and ideas from a game that didn't work and asking to give it a second chance. Now, is it possible the ideas and concepts from these previous games be given into a new game, possibly recycled? Sure. There were some ideas from these games that could be salvaged and or recycled into a new game, but to, let's say, have a reignited version of Enter the Dragonfly and calling it Enter the Dragonfly Reignited is an awful idea. Even if the game was taken to a 10 out of 10 quality, the sheer name brings negative thoughts to those who have played it before. Another point I like to make is that both of the remakes banked on nostalgia. Yes, they were both good, but we would be fooling ourselves if we said that nostalgia had nothing to do with selling of these games. Of course, people who never played the games before would love these games as well, but nostalgia did play a large part in the marketing and selling of this game. If any of the previous games made by both Spyro and Crash were attempted to be remade, the nostalgic aspect, which the remakes banked a lot of their selling points on, would not be there for most fans, as not many of the fans that love the original trilogies even played these newer games. Again, think of this as a business. Would you like to attempt to resell a game that sold an average of 7 million units and scored rather favorably, or a game that just broke 1 million units and was not met with great reception? Do you see what I mean? Let's talk about the only exception to this rule. That is Crash Team Racing. So, why is it that this spin-off is the only game that's being remade that is outside the original trilogy? Well, there are 3 reasons. The first one is straight up performance. The game's average critic score is an 88 out of 100 and sold 4.8 million units on one console, making this game overall the second best critically rated Crash Bandicoot game of all time, and it's considered a spin-off. None of the previously mentioned games that are outside of either trilogies came even close to how well this game performed overall. Secondly, a pattern that we have followed year to year with Activision is that they like to get at least one new release of a child-friendly game each year. 2017 was the Crash Insane trilogy, 2018 was Spyro Reignited, and now 2019 will be CTR. Now, to our knowledge, no other Crash or Spyro game is coming out this year. it is likely that Activision wanted to give extra time to the next Spyro and Crash titles by putting CTR as sort of a buffer between both new titles, giving the respective companies more time to develop the new games. Thirdly, kart racers are not as common of a genre today and is largely dominated by Nintendo with their entry of Mario Kart. To have a kart racer with nostalgic value be multi-platform is a very smart business choice, as there is not a lot of competition in this genre, especially outside the Nintendo line of consoles. In fact, if I am correct, for the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One generation, there's only been one kart racing game that's been released so far and is not an indie title, and that is Nickelodeon Kart Racers, which did overwhelmingly bad. The only other kart racers coming for this console generation is Team Sonic Racing and Crash Team Racing Nitro Fueled. So there's literally one game that CTR has to compete with in this generation, which means it'll very likely sell well, as it is also banking off the fact of nostalgia as well. One last point to be made: these remakes were designed for two reasons. The first one is to call attention back to these IPs and see who is interested. They want to see if there's still life and if people are still willing to hand over their cash for a game that they likely have already played, but with better graphics and sound. Also, these games, in terms of critic scores and sales, are objectively the best games, so you want to remake the top of the line games to gather the most interest possible. The second reason is to train the developers in how to make these games by following the steps of the original developers to make better future games if the remaster succeeds. They can take what they learned from following the same steps and apply it to the new game so it feels like a real spiritual successor. To bring another remake that is not just slightly worse in terms of performance makes no sense. What we need are new games. New games with new adventures with our favorite characters. We love these IPs and the adventures that we have had with them, but we need to move on. If we want these games to continue succeeding and continue to grow after their comeback, we need new content. We do not want to have an epic comeback and then have the game slide back into irrelevancy because we as fans couldn't let go of the past. These games still exist, and there are different ways to play them today. Let's look at the bright future together as friends and fans. Thanks so much for watching. Cue the extra.